What is up guys, Morton here from SteamFirst.com with a review for The Dungeoning, a 2D RPG developed by Nick Donnelly and released April 24th, 2014 on Steam for $9. The Dungeoning is a pretty interesting game. It's very difficult, but at the same time very fun. First off, let's talk about what exactly the game is, because it's certainly not a game for everybody. You control a nameless character and attempt to make your way out of what I imagine is a dungeon. The game has basic 2D RPG gameplay, but with a few things that make the game quite hard. First off, if you die you don't respawn, you have to completely restart the game, but every time you do everything is randomly generated, so it doesn't really get repetitive because you'll never have the same level twice. As for the gameplay itself, you gain experience and levels from defeating monsters, some of which are very easy to kill, and some require quite a lot of effort. Then you use that to put points in one of 4 stats: strength, vitality, defense, or magic. Unfortunately, the game doesn't bother to tell you exactly what the stats do, so you're kinda left guessing for a little while. In fact, most of the things in this game are left completely unexplained. Most RPGs would tell you the stats of the items you're picking up, but the Dungeoning just gives you the item drop and then lets you experiment until you figure out if it's better or worse than what you already have. Now this isn't a massive complaint, because after you play for a while you'll kinda figure it out, but until that point, having to constantly switch weapons and hit one enemy then switch back and see how much damage each does is kind of annoying. As for the level design, I'd say it's very good. There's some hidden things on a lot of levels, and everything is randomly generated, so it doesn't get boring or repetitive for the most part. There's also some traps, such as falling blocks, that can hurt you and you need to watch out for them, and since it's random every time, it requires you to pay a fair bit of attention to the map layout. The difficulty seems to be kind of all over the place, unfortunately. The game starts off pretty hard, but if you kill the majority of enemies every level, then it gets easy pretty fast, since you'll be able to level up and increase your damage. But then, after you complete a few levels, all the enemies suddenly increase in strength, and it becomes really hard again. So it's this weird curve of really hard, then pretty easy, then really hard, then pretty easy, as the enemies spike in difficulty until you level up enough to deal with it. The combat is pretty fun, but not very in-depth. You use either a sword, bow, slingshot, or magic staff, and basically just mash the attack button until the thing you're fighting dies. The sword is obviously for close range combat, the bow is for long range combat, and the slingshot is for medium range combat. The slingshot also has an arc to get over walls, which comes in handy sometimes, but you can basically use the bow for everything and save yourself the trouble. And the staff is basically the same as the bow, but uses magic instead of arrows. But arrows drop from everything, so you'll never really run out. Range combat is kind of broken in that the majority of enemies are melee only, so you can kill things without even really ever putting yourself in danger, but the bigger and tougher enemies usually have a range attack, so it doesn't trivialize the entire game. Overall, the gameplay is really fun, even though the difficulty changes so rapidly. My only real complaints are that there's nothing explaining most of the items in the game, so you have no way of knowing what things do unless you just try them out. It's not that big of a deal. A lot of the items you can figure out just by their name and what they look like. For example, a red potion heals, a blue potion refills magic, etc. And the rest you can figure out just by experimenting for a minute. Gameplay gets a 4.5 out of 5. Everything works really well, and it's challenging for most of the game. Graphically, the game is pretty retro, but it looks good. It's easy to figure out all of the important things, such as where and what the enemies are. There's also some things that aren't so easy to figure out, such as what items are which, because some of them look very similar. It's not really that bad though, and doesn't impact the game negatively. The graphics get a 4 out of 5. They aren't super realistic, but they have a nice retro feel, and the backgrounds to the levels look really nice and well done. As for replayability, since everything is randomly generated, you won't play the same levels twice, so there's certainly reason to play it over and over. On top of that, there's also New Game Plus, so in case it wasn't difficult enough the first time through, you can make it even harder. There aren't any achievements though, which in a game like this would be kind of hard to implement, but certainly doable, and even though everything is random, that doesn't mean it won't get repetitive eventually when you're just doing the same thing every time. Especially once you realize what each enemy's weakness is, because some of them are very easy to kill with certain weapons. Replayability gets a 3.5 out of 5. Just replaying the game will start to get boring eventually, even though everything is randomized. If there were achievements or something to aim for, it would add quite a bit of value. Overall, the Dungeoning gets a 4 out of 5. It's a lot of fun and everything works well. There's no story to this game, but it doesn't really need one. The gameplay is really enjoyable, and even though the controls aren't the greatest, they certainly aren't terrible. If you're looking for a challenging 2D RPG and don't care much about story, then this game is definitely worth looking into, because there's certainly a lot of good things about it.